Last time we spoke about the North Borneo Offensive. General Buckner's 10th Army captured strategic locations, including Shuri Castle, marking a turning point. Simultaneously, General Eichelberger's forces liberated Mindanao, overcoming tough Japanese defenses in the mountainous terrain. As he approached Malibale, fierce resistance resulted in heavy casualties, but the Americans persisted, inflicting significant losses on their foe. By June the 9th, the Americans pressed further into the enemy's defensive lines, leading to intense combat. The Marines landed on Oroku Peninsula, where fierce fighting revealed the tenacity of the Japanese defenders. General Ushijima prepared for a final stand as American forces began to encircle and dismantle Japanese positions. As the campaign unfolded, Australians under Brigadier Whitehead launched the North Borneo Offensive, landing on Tarakan and swiftly pushing the Japanese into the rugged interior. This episode is Victory at Okinawa. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast, week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and you can help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you consider checking out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on my YouTube channel, I just released a rather comedic episode covering Call of Duty World at War. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And over on the exclusive podcast series, our latest episode covers the entire history of the USS Hornet CV-8. So if that's of interest to you, please go check it out. Okinawa was more than just a battlefield. It became a symbol of sacrifice, the last heroic stand of a fading empire. By this point in the war, Japan was facing an inevitable defeat, yet their resolve remained unbroken. They clung to the samurai spirit, determined to fight to the bitter end out of honor and duty. The stakes were very high. Japan needed precious time to fortify its home islands, to stretch the conflict as long as possible. To achieve this, over 100,000 brave souls were sent into the fray, sacrificing their lives to slow the American advance and inflict as many casualties as they possibly could. As we've explored in previous episodes, this fierce determination fueled their resistance. And now we stand at a pivotal moment, the final days of the Battle of Okinawa, the last major confrontation of the Pacific War. Now, as we last left off, it was June the 16th, and General Buckner's 10th Army had just made significant strides, capturing most of southern Okinawa and finally breaking through the last major enemy defenses at the Yajudake-Yuzadake escarpment. The remnants of General Ushijima's 32nd Army were now locked in a desperate fight to hold on to the Kiamu Peninsula, slowly being pushed back towards the sea in what was becoming their ultimate demise. The following day, on June the 17th, the assault continued with renewed determination. General Hodge's 24th Corps worked to consolidate its hard-won gains in the escarpment. Over on the west coast, General Shepard's 6th Marine Division took action as Colonel Roberts' 22nd Marines stepped in to relieve the weary 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, at the northern slope of Mizato Ridge. With a fierce spirit, they began to push southward, successfully securing most of the ridge. To the east, General Deval's 1st Marine Division forged ahead. Colonel Snedeker's fresh 3rd Battalion took over from the exhausted 1st Battalion, and they advanced 1,400 yards to seize some high ground just east of Mizato. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines fought hard to capture the remaining positions on Kunishi Ridge, achieving only a gradual extension to the east. Colonel Griebel's 3rd Battalion moved in behind them to reinforce the isolated Marines, bravely fending off a fierce counterattack under the cover of night. Further east, Colonel Dill's 382nd Regiment systematically eliminated the last enemy positions in the Yuza-Ozato-Yuzadake area, while Colonel Halloran's 381st Regiment held some firm positions against successful counter-assaults, but they managed to capture Hill 153 before Colonel Green's 184th Regiment took over during the night. Lastly, Colonel Finn's 32nd Regiment secured the reverse slopes of Hill 115, preparing to launch an attack on Mabuni and Hill 89. By nightfall, Hodge's 24th Corps had firmly secured all the commanding heights on the Uzedake escarpment. Most of Misado's Ridge and Kunishi Ridge were now in American hands, and Colonel Wallace's 8th Marines had just landed to the rear to bolster the western push. For the first time, American forces across the line looked down upon nearly 8 square miles of enemy-held territory, a staggering view of what lay ahead. Realizing that they were forced from their last defensive positions and that their destruction was imminent, the 32nd Army began to unravel, collapsing into chaos. On the 18th, Hodge's troops seized the opportunity to strike decisively. The 32nd Regiment advanced down the coast towards Mabuni, facing increasing resistance. The 184th Regiment moved down the reverse slopes of Hill 153, closing in on Madeira, while the 381st Regiment speedily crossed the plateau, tackling scattered enemy fire to seize some high ground just 400 yards north of Madeira. Simultaneously, Dill's 3rd Battalion crashed through some rugged mazes of caves and pillboxes, making a daring 600-yard advance to the base of the rocky ridge north of Arugachi. To the west, Griebel's 1st Battalion circled the eastern end of Kunishi Ridge, battling heavy resistance to gain the lower slopes of Hill 79. Further west, Robert's 2nd Battalion pushed through the 3rd and aimed for Kuenaga Ridge, successfully seizing a 1,000-yard stretch by the late afternoon. As they advanced, the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines moved forward to occupy the eastern end of said ridge. Meanwhile, the remainder of the 22nd Marines began to mop up the remnants of resistance on Misado Ridge. Tragedy struck when Colonel Roberts was tragically killed by a sniper near his observation post during this operation. Lieutenant Colonel August Larson would succeed him in command. Sadly, Roberts would not be the only American commander to fall that day. In the heart of the Marine line, the 8th Marines were finally called into action in the morning to relieve the weary 7th Marines. After a rigorous artillery bombardment to soften up the enemy defenses, Wallace's 2nd Battalion began its advance south towards Coanga-Maccabi Road, successfully capturing the high ground just north of the road by the late afternoon. Meanwhile, General Buckner decided to visit Wallace's command post on Misado Ridge around midday. He observed the 8th Marine's steady progress in the valley, taking stock of their relentless push forward. Tragically, as he was leaving the observation post, disaster struck. 5 artillery shells rained down, one striking a coral outcrop near him. The jagged shards of coral filled the air, and Buckner was mortally wounded in the chest. He would die within minutes, just days shy of achieving his goal, the complete capture of Okinawa. With Buckner's passing, General Geiger, as the senior troop commander, took over temporary command of the 10th Army for the remainder of the battle. Buckner became the highest-ranking American military officer killed in World War II, and he would hold the somber distinction throughout the entire 20th century. On the 18th, the final written order from General Ushijima of the 32nd Army outlined a daring escape plan. He designated an officer to lead the Blood and Iron Youth Organization, tasked with conducting guerrilla warfare once organized combat had ceased. Simultaneously, he ordered his remaining troops to make their way to the northern mountains of Okinawa, where a small band of guerrillas was rumored to be operating. In his message, he congratulated them on fulfilling their, quote, assigned mission in a manner which leaves nothing to regret. I am urging you to fight to the last and die for the eternal cause of loyalty to the Emperor. This movement was not to happen in haste. Soldiers were instructed to travel in small groups of 2 to 5 over the course of several days. They were urged to don civilian clothing and avoid confrontation whenever possible. In a clever stratagem, most of the Army staff officers were directed to leave the command post disguised as native Okinawans, aiming to infiltrate American lines and find safety in northern parts of Okinawa. Some individuals, like Colonel Yahara, were entrusted with the mission of reaching Japan to report to the Imperial General Headquarters. Others were tasked with organizing guerrilla operations, focusing on harassing the rear areas of the 10th Army and the Island Command, determined to continue the fight against the American forces in any way that they could. Again, I have read Yahara's book on the Battle of Okinawa, and despite being full of apologetic stuff and attempts to make himself look a lot better, it's one of the most insightful books on the Japanese perspective of said battle. You get a lot of information on how bad it was for the Okinawan civilians, especially in the caves. It's honestly harrowing stuff. I highly recommend reading it. The American attack pressed in on June the 19th, though it faced delays due to the influx of civilian and military prisoners. Not all of the 32nd Army survivors were imbued with a will to, quote, die for the eternal cause of loyalty to the Emperor. Loudspeakers mounted on tanks in the 7th Division's front lines and on LCIs were cruising up and down the coastline, trying to convince over 3,000 civilians to surrender. Far more significant, however, were the 106 Japanese soldiers and the 238 Boitai who voluntarily gave up during the division's advance on the 19th. The relentless attack of American troops, coupled with intensive efforts by psychological warfare teams, brought in increasing numbers of battle-weary Japanese and Okinawans who had decided that the war was lost and their cause was hopeless. It is not inconceivable that every enemy soldier who surrendered meant one less American casualty, as a wind-up drive of the 10th Army continued. Despite these challenges, the 32nd Regiment advanced to within just 200 yards of the outskirts of Mabuni. Meanwhile, the 184th and 381st Regiments coordinated their efforts, closing in on Madeira from the south and east. The 382nd Regiment pressed forward, overcoming fierce resistance as they reached the ridges overlooking Aragachi. Tragically, General Easley became the third major high-ranking casualty in just 2 days. The 5th Marines launched multiple assaults on Hill 79 and 81, but their efforts were met with fierce opposition and ended in failure. Wallace's 3rd Battalion, facing only light resistance, captured Ibato Ridge, the last high ground before the sea, before pushing onwards to the coastal cliffs. On the eastern front, Griebel's 3rd Battalion successfully seized Makabe and then joined forces with the 8th Marines to secure the coastal zone. Colonel Shapley's 4th Marines advanced alongside the 8th Marines throughout most of the day, but they were unable to reach the coast, halted by a formidable enemy position along the Kiamu-Gusuku Hill Mass. Further south, Colonel Whaling's 29th Marines pressed through the 22nd Marines and moved rapidly, also facing some light resistance, reaching the base of the Kiamu-Gusuku Hill Mass to link up with the 4th Marines before nightfall. The 4th Marines successfully seized Hill 80, but they could only establish strong positions on the left flank of Hill 72. The 29th Marines encountered minimal opposition as they swept forward towards the southern coast. Meanwhile, the 5th Marines continued their relentless assaults on Hills 79 and 81, managing to capture most of Hill 79 before losing the crest at the last moment. Their tank infantry assaults against Hill 81, however, once again ended in defeat. Looking east towards Hodges' front on the 21st, the 382nd Regiment cleared out the last remnants of Aragachi, while the 381st Regiment seized the northern outskirts of Madeira. In the dark hours of the 20th, the last courier contact was made between the Madeira pocket and the Hill 89 pocket. General Amamiya, commander of the 24th Division, issued a desperate order directing all of his units to, quote, fight to the last man in the present position. At the time he gave this ultimatum, he had very few infantrymen left to defend the Madeira position. The relentless advance of the Marines had already nearly annihilated the 22nd and 32nd Regiments, while the 96th Division had decimated the 89th Regiment at the Uzudake and Aragachi areas. With their ranks severely depleted, the remaining defenders were a ragtag collection of artillerymen, drivers, corpsmen, engineers, boitai, and headquarters personnel drawn from nearly every unit of the Elde inland garrison. Those who managed to avoid surrender or sought to evade capture fought with fierce determination, resolutely defending their positions against overwhelming odds. Meanwhile, Colonel Coolidge's 305th Regiment engaged in a vigorous mop-up operation behind the lines of the 96th Division, preparing for an assault on Makabe Ridge. The 184th Regiment managed to secure some hills overlooking Udo, and despite facing fierce resistance from hidden enemy forces in coral outcroppings and caves along the coastal cliffs, the 32nd Regiment fought its way to the eastern slopes of Hill 89. Throughout the 21st, a series of small local attacks and mopping-up actions occupied most of the units of the 24th Corps, often interrupted to allow large numbers of civilians and soldiers to surrender. In spite of the bitter and costly resistance, the 32nd Regiment successfully secured Mabuni and advanced up the tableland atop Hill 89. Coolidge's 1st Battalion launched an assault on the hill south of Madeira behind a heavy mortar barrage, successfully capturing its crest. The 5th Marines completed the capture of Hill 79 and undertook a heavy and costly assault that ultimately led to the capture of Hill 81. The 7th and 8th Marines began a crucial task of flushing out the remaining Japanese holdouts while also dealing with the increasing waves of soldiers and civilians choosing to surrender. The 4th Marines executed a successful double envelopment of Hill 72 that secured the strategic Kiamu-Gusuki Ridge, and the 29th Marines met only light resistance during their sweep of Arasaki, the southernmost point of the island. This swift progress and the obvious collapse of major enemy opposition prompted General Geiger to declare that the island of Okinawa was secure and that organized enemy resistance had come to an end. That night, in a tragic turn of events, Generals Ushijima and Cho committed seppuku in the caves housing their command post. It was the night of June the 21st. Lieutenant General Ushijima Mitsuru and Lieutenant General Cho Izamu fulfilled their final obligation to the emperor in a deeply traditional manner. In accordance with the warrior code of their homeland, they atoned for their inability to halt the American advance by committing seppuku. On the evening of their planned departure, Ushijima hosted a banquet in the cave that served as his command post, featuring a large meal prepared by his cook, Tetsuo Nakamutam. The banquet was generously complimented with sake and the remaining stock of captured black and white Scotch whiskey provided by Cho. At 3 a.m. on the 22nd, both generals adorned their full field uniforms, decorated with medals, and they led a small party of aides and staff officers into a narrow ledge at the cave entrance, which was overlooking the ocean. American soldiers of the 32nd Regiment were actually stationed less than 100 feet away, completely unaware of the solemn preparations taking place for a suicide ceremony. First, Ushijima bared his abdomen to the ceremonial knife and thrust inward, followed by Cho, who then fell to the ground. As Ushijima made his final act, a simultaneous slash from the headquarters adjutant saber struck his bowed neck. The two generals were secretly buried immediately after their deaths, their bodies going undiscovered until June the 25th, when patrols of the 32nd Regiment found them at the foot of a seaward cliff face around Hill 89. General Cho had penned his own simple epitaph stating, 22nd day, 6th month, 20th year of the Showa era. I depart without regret, fear, shame, or obligations. Army Chief of Staff, Army Lieutenant General Cho Izamu. Age of departure, 51 years. At this time and place, I hereby certify the foregoing. Their deaths were witnessed by Colonel Yahara, who was the most senior officer captured by the American forces later. Yahara had requested Ushijima's permission to commit suicide as well, but the general had refused, stating, If you die, there will be no one left who knows the truth about the Battle of Okinawa. Bear the temporary shame, but endure it. This is an order from your army commander. While many diehard groups continued to fight until annihilation, an unprecedented number of Japanese soldiers, both officers and enlisted men, would begin to surrender. On that fateful day, Operation Tengo's final breaths were marked by the launch of a 2-day 10th Kekuzai mass attack, which saw only 45 kamikaze aircraft take to the skies. While this desperate attempt succeeded in sinking LCM-59 and damaged the destroyer escort Halloran, as well as the seaplane tenders Curtis and Kenneth Whitney, the next day would bring even less impact, with only 2 landing ships sustaining damage during the final attack of the campaign. As communications from the 32nd Army fell silent, a deeply regretful Admiral Ugaki was forced to conclude the grim reality of their situation. I felt greatly responsible for the calamity. But he recognized that there was seemingly no alternative course that might have led to a success. Throughout the defense of Okinawa, approximately 6,000 sorties were flown, including at least 1,900 kamikaze missions. However, the losses were staggering, with over 4,000 aircraft lost during these attacks. In contrast, Allied forces suffered the loss of 763 planes in the Okinawa campaign, with 305 of those being operational losses. Since the operation commenced, naval losses for Iceberg totaled an alarming 4,992 sailors dead, with 36 ships sunk, 334 damaged, accounting for about 17% of all American naval losses in the Pacific War. Meanwhile, extensive and coordinated mop-up operations in the southern parts of Okinawa were essential before the area could be deemed secure for the planned construction of supply depots, airfields, training areas, and port facilities. In response, Colonel Mason's 1st Marines and Colonel Hamilton's 307th Regiment established blocking positions in the hills above the Naha-Yonobaru Valley to thwart any Japanese attempts to infiltrate. On June the 22nd, the 4 assault divisions that had previously shattered the Kiamu Peninsula defenses received orders to prepare for a sweeping advance to the north. Their mission was quite clear. Destroy any remaining resistance, blow and seal all caves, bury the dead, and salvage any equipment, both friendly and enemy, left on the battlefield. The following day, General Joseph Stilwell, Vinegar Joe, arrived to take command of the 10th Army during the mop-up phase of the campaign. Meanwhile, units from the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions were engaged on the Kimisu and Kiyamukasuku ridges, while the 7th Division probed Hill 89 and Mabuni. Within the Madeira pocket, Coolidge's 3rd Battalion successfully seized Hill 85 on the 22nd. The 96th Division intensified its focus in the Madeira Aragachi area, while elements of the 381st Regiment mopped up the last holdouts in the ruins of Madeira by June the 23rd. 2 days later, after a thorough search of the area south of the Yajudake-Yuzadake escarpment, the 10th Army finally initiated its drive northward, with both corps taking responsibility for the ground that they had captured in the previous month. On the morning of June the 26th, the reinforced Fleet Marine Force Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion landed unopposed on Kumojima, marking it as the last and largest of the Okinawa Islands selected for radar and fighter director sites. By the end of June, the mop-up operations in southern Okinawa had resulted in an estimated 8,975 Japanese killed and 3,808 prisoners of war added to the 10th Army's total. Overall, the Americans counted a staggering total of 10,755 prisoners of war and 107,539 Japanese dead, along with an estimated 23,764 believed to be sealed in caves or buried by their comrades. This cumulative casualty figure of 142,058 was, quote, far above a reasonable estimate of military strength on the island, prompting the 10th Army intelligence officers to conclude that at least 42,000 civilians had tragically fallen victim to artillery, naval, and aerial attacks due to their unfortunate proximity to the Japanese combat forces and installations. American losses were quite substantial, with 7,374 men recorded dead, 31,807 wounded, and 239 missing, in addition to 26,221 non-battle casualties. To say the Battle of Okinawa was hell is an understatement. But now it's time to leave Okinawa and return to Borneo to continue covering the North Borneo offensive. As we last left off, by mid-June, General Wooten's 9th Australian Division had successfully executed 2 major amphibious landings on Brunei Bay. Brigadier Porter's 24th Brigade occupied most of the Labuan Island, with the exception of the pocket, while Brigadier Windayer's 20th Brigade secured the Brunei area. By the 16th, Wooten decided that since the enemy was withdrawing and showing no signs of mounting an attack, he would take control of the high ground stretching from Mempaucul and Menumbok to Cape Nosong. This strategic move aimed to prevent the enemy from utilizing the track from Kota Klias to Caracan and to secure the beaches for supply points during the planned advance northward. Accordingly, Porter ordered the 2 and 28th Battalion to reduce the pocket. The recently landed 2 and 12th Commando Squadron was tasked with mopping up the outlying areas of the island. Meanwhile, the 2 and 32nd Battalion began preparing for an amphibious movement to Weston on the mainland east of Labuan, with plans to go across country by river towards Beaufort. 2 and 43rd Battalion and the 2 and 11th Commando Squadron were also set to prepare for an amphibious reconnaissance in the Mapakul area. On June the 14th, the 2 and 28th Battalion launched its initial attack against the pocket, following an artillery barrage. However, they were forced to withdraw in the face of intense machine gun mortar fire. In response, the 2 and 12th Field Regiment took over, bombarding the pocket for the next 6 days, hurling a staggering total of 140 tons of shells into it. On June the 16th, the 2 and 28th Battalion launched another assault, this time supported by tanks from the north, successfully capturing Leon Ridge despite sustaining heavy losses. After several more days of relentless artillery, naval, and air bombardment, 2 and 28th launched a final assault on June the 21st. Just as the Japanese attempted to send 2 raiding parties to infiltrate through the Australian lines and attack Labuan town and its airstrip. Although these raiders managed to catch the confused defenders off guard and inflicted several casualties, they were ultimately dealt with swiftly and without causing significant damage. Meanwhile, with the combined support of tanks and artillery, the 2 and 28th Battalion attacked the reduced garrison at the pocket, breaking through Lingshington Ridge and Eastman Spur to eliminate the remaining Japanese positions and completely clear the area. By the end of the Battle of Labuan, the Australians had achieved a decisive victory, with 389 Japanese soldiers killed and 11 taken prisoner, while suffering 34 Australian fatalities and 93 wounded. In parallel, following a successful reconnaissance on June the 16th, the 2 and 32nd Battalion landed unopposed on Weston on the 17th. They quickly secured the area and established a patrol base at Linkungan. Over the next few days, Australian patrols began probing north towards Bukau, occasionally clashing with Japanese parties. A company from the 2 and 32nd Battalion also established a patrol base at Gadong up the Padas River, finding no Japanese presence in the surrounding regions. From this position, the Australians were able to patrol along the Padas River in small craft, discovering that they could reach Beaufort rapidly using this route, catching the enemy off guard. Meanwhile, on the 19th, the 243rd Battalion and the 211th Independent Company landed unopposed on Membakul, further solidifying the Australian presence in the area. 2 days later, while the commandos worked to clear Claas Peninsula, the 243rd Battalion launched an amphibious expedition up the Claas River. This mission successfully navigated through Singorap and reached Kota Claas, confirming that Japanese forces were not present in significant strength along the river. As a result, the 243rd Battalion set out on June the 22nd to occupy Kota Claas without encountering any resistance. Given this positive momentum, Brigadier Porter ordered the 228th Battalion to take over operations from the 232nd Battalion in and around Weston. At the same time, the 243rd Battalion was tasked with marching through Kandu to attack Beaufort by the north. Additionally, the 232nd Battalion was directed to probe north along the Padas River and along its railway, drawing enemy attention away from the main Australian advance. Looking south, while the 217th Battalion remained around Brunei and the 215th Battalion probed along the river towards Lembang, Windayer had ordered the 213th Battalion to prepare for an amphibious movement to Mir Lutong's area. Brunei town had been severely battered by Allied bombers and Japanese demolitions. The troops were critical of the Air Force's practice of bombing conspicuous buildings even when they're unlikely to contain anything of military importance. In Brunei, for example, the bazaar and the cinema were destroyed, but neither was likely to have contained any Japanese men or materials, and their destruction and the destruction of similar buildings added to the distress of the civilians. The infantrymen on the ground saw the effects of the bombing at a receiving end. The impression was gained, says a report of the 20th Brigade, that in the oil-producing and refining centers of Syria, Kuala Belait, Lutong, Miri, much of the destruction served no military purpose. The destruction of the native bazaar and the shop area in Kuala Belait, Brunei, Tutong, and Miri seemed wanton. On June the 16th, the 217th finally moved out and occupied Tutong, successfully crossing the river at its mouth. From there, the battalion began its movement along the coast towards Syria. However, despite the strategic importance of the town's oil wells, there was only one encounter with the enemy at the Bira River on June the 20th before the town was occupied the following day, only to find the oil wells ablaze. And ablaze they were. From the broken pipes that topped each well, burning oil gushed forth like fire from immense hissing Bunsen burners. The pressure was so intense that the oil, as clear as petrol, only ignited several inches away from the pipe. Once ignited, it transformed into a tumbling cloud of flame, accompanied by billowing blue-black smoke. At approximately 1,000 feet, the plumes from more than 30 fires merged into a single canopy of smoke. This horrifying spectacle of waste persisted day and night. The men around Syria fell asleep to the hissing and rumbling of an entire oil field engulfed in flames and awoke to the same din. The Japanese had set fire to 37 wells, destroyed buildings and bridges, and attempted to incapacitate vehicles, pumps, and other equipment by removing essential components and either discarding them in the river. Consequently, the Australian engineers faced the daunting task of extinguishing the fires with only their own equipment, along with abandoned gear that they could repair or make functional. They relied on the assistance from local natives who had observed the Japanese hiding parts and employed methods of improvisation and selective cannibalization to tackle the crisis. Meanwhile, by June the 19th, raiding elements of the 250th Battalion had successfully secured Lembang. From this location, they began sending patrols up the Lembang River towards Wukong, along the Pandurian River to Angun, and east towards Tusan. The following day, after a naval bombardment by 3 American destroyers, the 213th Battalion landed unopposed at Lutong and quickly secured the area. On the 21st, the Australians crossed the river and advanced into Miri without facing any resistance, successfully occupying the town and its oil field by the 23rd. Turning their attention back north, on June the 24th, the 243rd Battalion began its advance towards Beaufort, swiftly moving through Kandu and reaching a position just north of the Padas River the next day. In response to their progress, Brigadier Porter ordered the 232nd Battalion to seize the railway terminus on the spur leading down to the river just south of Beaufort, while the 243rd focused on capturing some high ground dominating Beaufort from the north and east. This coordinated attack was launched on the 26th. By the end of the day, the leading company of the 232nd had reached the Padas River, approximately 2,000 yards west of the railway terminus, while the leading company of the 243rd secured the railway north of Padas, similarly positioned about 2,000 yards from Beaufort. On the 27th, the 243rd continued their offensive, rapidly capturing some high ground overlooking Beaufort. During the afternoon, one company ascended Mount Lally and pursued the retreating Japanese, cutting off their escape route at a track junction, while another company moved into the town, taking possession early that night. In the following hours and throughout June the 28th, the Australians faced a series of heavy counterattacks as they worked to consolidate their positions. Meanwhile, the 2 and 32nd Battalion successfully captured the railway terminus, encountering only slight opposition, with one company executing a wide flanking maneuver to Padas just upstream from Beaufort. Under heavy bombardment from artillery and mortars, the bulk of the 368th Independent Battalion began to retreat along the Australian-held track in the early hours of June the 29th. While many were killed during this withdrawal, most managed to escape. At intervals, groups of 2 to 3 walked into the company area in the darkness, and they were killed. Fire was strictly controlled, and one platoon was credited for having killed 21 Japanese and 21 single shots fired at ranges of about 15 yards. One Japanese walked onto the track 50 yards from the foremost Australian bread gun position and demanded to surrender to the Australians, who were blocking the Japanese line of retreat. According to an observer, his words were, "Surrender, please. Aussie, you come, no?" It was promptly shot. One company counted 81 Japanese killed with company weapons only round the junction and estimated that at least 35 others had been killed. 6 Australians were slightly wounded. By morning, the fighting was virtually over, and the mop-up of the disorganized enemy force commenced. The attack on Beaufort cost the 24th Brigade 7 men killed and 38 wounded, while the Australians counted 93 Japanese dead and took 2 prisoners. Meanwhile, the 2 and 28th Battalion secured Lumadan village, where they made contact with the 2 and 32nd. Porter then ordered his battalion to pursue the retreating Japanese eastward, successfully securing the Montenoir-Bissar railway bridge by July the 4th. The 2 and 32nd Battalion proceeded to attack towards Papar, encountering little opposition as they captured Bambakut on July the 5th, followed by Kimenis on July the 10th, and finally Papar on the 12th. Turning back south, the 2 and 17th Battalion occupied Kuala Belait on the 24th of June, where they discovered evidence of a massacre of Indian prisoners of war. Indian prisoners of war began reaching the lines of the 2 and 17th Battalion at Sarai on June the 22nd. By the end of the month, a total of 41 had arrived, reporting a horrific event. On June the 14th, the Japanese had slaughtered a portion of a group of more than 100 Indian prisoners at Kuala Belait. The Australians discovered 24 charred bodies at the site, along with evidence indicating that others had been killed. A report by the 2 and 17th noted, "The motive for the massacre is not clear, and whether a partial loss of rations, the waving of flags, or simply Japanese brutality was responsible cannot be determined." The surviving Indians were found to be starving, with many suffering from illnesses. Colonel Broadbent remarked, "The loyalty and fortitude of these Indians has been amazing, and is a lesson to us all. Even now, their standard of discipline is quite high." 2 days later, patrols made contact with the 2 and 13th Battalion at the Banam River. Pushing south along Riam Road, the patrols of the 2 and 13th clashed with the Japanese at a south knoll, which they captured by the end of the month. Throughout July, the 2 and 13th continued patrolling down Riam Road against some opposition, eventually pushing the Japanese beyond Bakam by August. At the same time, the 2 and 17th conducted deep patrols southward from Kuala Belait, particularly along the Bram River towards Bakung, Marudi, and Nabi. Overall, Australian losses during the North Borneo offensive totaled 114 killed and 221 wounded, while they captured 130 prisoners and accounted for at least 1,234 Japanese killed. Now, following the conclusion of conventional military operations, Wooten's troops began to support the efforts of Australian-sponsored native guerrillas, operating in Sarawak under Operation Summit, and in British North Borneo as part of Operation Agus. Between March and July of 1945, 5 Special Operations Australian SOA parties were inserted into North Borneo. The Agus 1 and 2 parties established networks of agents and guerrillas in northwestern Borneo, while the Agus 4 and 5 parties landed on the eastern coast, achieving little in their missions. The Agus 3 party investigated the Ranau area, and at the request of the 1st Corps. The results of Operation Agus were quite mixed. Although its parties established control over the respective areas of operation and provided intelligence of variable quality, they were responsible for killing fewer than 100 Japanese soldiers. In parallel, as part of Operation Summit, over 100 Allied personnel, mainly Australians, were inserted by air into Sarawak from March 1945, organized into 4 parties. These parties were tasked with collecting intelligence and establishing guerrilla forces. The indigenous Dayaks of Sarawak's interior enthusiastically joined these guerrilla groups, essentially allowing SOA personnel to lead small private armies. No. 200 Flight RAF and the Royal Australian Navy's Snake-class junks played crucial roles in this campaign, facilitating the insertion of SOA personnel and supplies. The guerrilla forces launched attacks to gain control over the interior of Sarawak, while the 9th Division focused on the coastal areas, oil fields, plantations, and the ports in North Borneo. The guerrillas operated from patrol bases around Balai, Ridan, and Marudi, as well as in the mountains and along key waterways, including the Paudaran and Limbang rivers, and along the railway connecting Beaufort and Tinom. Their objective was to disrupt Japanese troop movements and interdict forces as they withdrew from the main combat zone. The RAF conducted airstrikes to support these lightly armed guerrillas, who at times had to evade better armed Japanese units. These guerrilla forces successfully raided several key towns and facilities, significantly disrupting enemy movements and efforts. It is estimated that over 1,800 Japanese soldiers were killed in North Borneo through guerrilla action, particularly by the fearsome Dayak people, whose fierce tactics and local knowledge played a crucial role in these operations. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/pacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 26 episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In the final throes of the Pacific War, the Battle for Okinawa became a fierce battleground for sacrifice and honor. As American forces led by General Buckner advanced, they shattered Japanese defenses, pushing them into a desperate rout. On June the 21st, General Ushijima and Lieutenant General Cho, recognizing their imminent defeat, committed seppuku, adhering to the samurai code. The chaotic battle led to staggering casualties, while many Japanese soldiers surrendered, realizing that their cause was lost. By June's end, Okinawa was secured, symbolizing not only a victory, but also the tragic cost of war, the countless lives lost on both sides.